Back then, Arthur Schlesinger, in his delimited liberal public discourse, equated sexual image with sin and the violent image as a blemish on American character. The problem, he argued, was the availability and easy access to guns, not the manufacturing, advocacy, and cultural usage of these weapons. Today, images of lone violent acts and of serial killers in particular also serve the politics of scapegoating and the demonization of these semi-human monsters as some kind of excrescence of society's underbelly. In the fictional and non-fictional arenas alike, representations of good and evil, nonviolent and violent, control and out of control, usually distort the texts and images that consumers use to imagine the realities of crime, justice, and punishment. When it comes to mediated violence, there is generally an exaggeration in the proportion of interpersonal violence depicted compared to that of the institutional and structural violence. Violence may occur in the home, but it typically occurs in the street. Either way, it is an individual rather than an institutional or structural thing. And rarely, when mass media exposes the violence in the boardrooms or executive suites, once again, it is typically portrayed as individualistic rather than as social or organized phenomena. When the latter themes appeared, after almost a decade of when the latter themes appeared after almost a decade of constant coverage in the case of the Westray mining explosion disaster in Canada that killed 26 people in the early 1990s, the mediated organizational causes that emerged ruled out the possibility of these acts being criminal, ruled out the imagination that these could be criminal. As McMullen and McClung concluded from their examination of news stories between 95 and 98, the dismissal or denial of a violent crime was the limit of the press's ability to tell the truth to powerful corporate and state interests, the place where the truth-telling was made coincident with the exercise of power. They further explained that, quote, news media produced its own version of interpretive denial. What happened at Westray was really something else. The corporate origins of death in the workplace was really something else. The loss of life was not crime, but something else. Scandal, abuse of office, negligence, and wrongdoing. While these were critical connotations, they were terms that carried implications of immorality rather than legal offense. They conveyed the novelty of the disaster rather than the mundane character of criminal actions leading up to the event. The press did not demarcate the corporation as capable of killing. And the news coverage, while registering a view from below, did not reconstitute the truth of Westray for what it was: state, corporate, criminality, and murder. In this sense, the media both challenged and reflected dominant conceptions of crime, law, and order. End quote. In the process, various stereotypes and myths of violence and nonviolence and of violent and nonviolent offenders are projected into our collective heads concerning news gathering and reporting on violent activities. The narratives often told are the products of procedures not to know. When it comes to stories on violent crime, for example, selective information provided by law enforcement and politicians may serve as a gatekeeping function in the social construction of violence. By interacting with and relying almost exclusively on official sources, news organizations invoke or reproduce prevailing views of serious crime or serious violence. The point is that out of a glut of possible violent stories, those that are selected and played over and over, literally or figuratively, are highly reflective of particular versions of socially violent and nonviolent realities. One-dimensional constructions of violence are contributed to by news stories that, for example, decry the mugging of elderly women, but do not include descriptions of these same elderly women living in public housing, surviving in cold rooms, undernourished and frail because of the domestic welfare policies and/or because of some corporations that have deprived them from their rightful pensions. Similarly, news reports both confirm and deny that in the USA, we are in, quote, the midst of a corporate crime wave, end quote, with a host of major companies continuing to be caught using Enron-style accounting scams and outright fraud. Currently under investigation for fraudulent accounting schemes, but not getting much news coverage, is none other than the grand old American institution, Coca-Cola Company. Some of the worst offenders to date include Health South Corporation, AOL Time Warner, Global Crossing, and communications giant WorldCom, the latter representing the biggest ever bankruptcy in U.S. history. Of course, the harms and injuries suffered directly and indirectly by the victims of these institutional and structural assaults are seldom, if ever, talked about in relation to their physical stress and psychological deterioration as a byproduct of those scams. The point is that the interpersonal acts of violence and their readerly texts are highly visible and condemned. The institutional or structural acts of violence, by contrast, are without readerly text and remain well hidden and ignored. The former news stories have legs and are recycled ad nauseam. The latter stories, though more newsworthy, have no legs and are quickly forgotten. The message here is neither novel nor new. Stuart Hills, in his 1987 book, Corporate Violence, Injury, and Death for Profit, called attention to the lack of news coverage on this kind of behavior and for the need to, quote, heighten awareness of the vast scope of serious harm caused by the illegal acts of respectable business executives who impersonally kill and maim many more Americans than street muggers and assailants do, end quote. Other distortions of violence are related to the fact that mediated messages may, in fact, relay different messages through their pictures and narratives, especially as these are related to gender and less so in terms of ethnicity and class. In terms of color, fictional accounts on television or on the motion picture screen are fairly undistorted and representative of the official rates of violent criminal activity. In terms of televised news coverage and the allegedly non-fictional tabloid shows of mysteries, crimes, and cops, a distortion of violence and violent acts appears to the detriment of African American males, illegal aliens from Mexico, and working class girls from broken homes. The images of these others, as portrayed on such shows as Cops, reinforce stereotypes that violent people are not like the rest of us. They are, quote, a strange and dangerous breed driven, unquote, to violence not because of poverty or injustice, but because they suffer from biological or psychological flaws, which may in fact be related to injustice and poverty. Never mind. As a consequence, politicians, media pundits, and the populace at large have no difficulty selling and buying, quote, the idea of an increasingly punitive criminal justice system with fewer constitutional restraints to keep neighborhoods safe from the demonic other we have constructed as criminal, end quote. Similarly, Romer, Jameson, and Ducoteau found, based on an analysis of homicide rates and an examination of 3 television stations in Philadelphia, that local news coverage engaged in a discourse of quote-unquote ethnic blame that was independent of realistic group conflict. Their research revealed that persons of color were heavily presented in stories about crimes of violence, and that within those stories they were more likely to be presented as perpetrators rather than as victims or persons reacting to or suffering from violence.